I am Lorraine Whitaker, 65 years old, a widow who once ran community sports programs in our small town, now retired and living quietly in the house my husband built. Most days my life is simple, shared with my eldest son Marcus, who still lives here, and brightened by visits from my grandson Daniel. But that night, everything I thought I knew about family, safety, and truth changed with a single phone call. The phone rang just after sunset. I wiped flour from my hands, thinking it might be Marcus telling me he would be late. But the name flashing across the screen made my chest tighten. It was Victor, my youngest, the one who had risen from our modest home to become a billionaire, co-owner of one of the most luxurious resorts on the coast. His voice was low, rushed, urgent. "Mother, is Elisa with you right now?" I hesitated, glancing toward the staircase. The shower was running upstairs, the familiar hum of water echoing through the pipes. "Yes, she is," I replied without thinking. "She arrived an hour ago. She said she needed to rest." There was a pause on the line, and then Victor's voice dropped to a whisper that sent a shiver down my spine. "That's impossible." I just watched Elisa check into the resort. She's here, standing at the front desk, smiling at the staff. I'm looking at her with my own eyes. The phone nearly slipped from my hand. I gripped the counter for balance, my pulse pounding in my ears. My daughter-in-law could not be in two places at once, yet I had just spoken to her when she walked through my front door, her perfume still lingering in the hallway. I tried to answer, to reason it away, but before I could, something else pierced the silence. Soft footsteps. They were behind me, deliberate and slow, moving closer across the wooden floor. My whole body froze. In that moment, my mind raced through every possibility. Was Victor mistaken? Was someone imitating Elisa? Or was I the one losing grip on reality? The air in the kitchen grew heavy, thick with fear and disbelief. I held the phone tight to my ear, but words refused to leave my mouth. I did not turn around right away. Instead, I listened, every nerve in me alert, the sound of those approaching steps louder than my heartbeat. I had never felt so vulnerable in my own home. A house that once carried laughter and love now felt like the stage for something I could not yet understand. That night was the beginning of a long unraveling, a thread pulled loose that would expose secrets no mother ever wishes to face. But before I take you deeper into this story, I need you to stay with me. These are not the kind of events one reads lightly and forgets. They test the limits of loyalty, of trust, and of what we choose to see when the truth is almost unbearable. If you're listening now, I invite you to lean in closer, the way I did when Victor's voice whispered through the phone. Let this story remind you that appearances can shatter in a second, and that sometimes the people we think we know best are carrying a life we never imagined. Stay until the end with me, because the way everything unfolded will stay with you long after the telling. I drew a slow breath and finally turned. What I saw in that moment would haunt me for nights to come, and it was only the first shadow of a much darker truth. Life in my house had settled into a rhythm that was both comforting and at times quietly unsettling. After the strange phone call with Victor, I tried to convince myself that what I had heard, what I thought I had seen, was a misunderstanding. Yet even as I carried on with my daily routines, a part of me could not let go of the unease. Perhaps that is why I began to pay closer attention to the small details of our family life, things I once overlooked. Marcus, my eldest, had never left home for long. He had tried city life after college, working in firms that promised grand projects and glamorous designs, but he always returned to our town, drawn back like the tide that always found the shore. Now he worked as an architect on his own terms, drafting plans at the desk near the window where the afternoon sun streamed through. He was diligent, serious, sometimes brooding, yet the kind of son who carried the groceries for me without complaint and asked, almost shyly, if I had eaten lunch. Living with him gave me a sense of continuity, as though my late husband's steady presence still lingered in the air through our boy. And then there was Elisa, Victor's wife, who drifted in and out of our home like a breeze, scented with lavender and mystery. To most, she seemed the picture of grace. She brought Daniel to me when Victor was away on business, always smiling, always thanking me with a gentleness that charmed neighbors and family alike. Her dark hair was always neatly tied, her dresses chosen with a care that suggested she was born to be admired. When she laughed, it was like bells at a wedding, light and captivating. Watching her, I could almost forget the icy echo of Victor's words that night, almost believe I had imagined the contradiction. Daniel, at 7 years old, was my joy. He would come running into the kitchen after school, dropping his backpack with a thud and begging for cookies, his eyes wide and expectant. I gave in more often than I should, slipping him extra pieces of chocolate while reminding him not to tell his parents. In those moments, I felt the ache of my husband's absence most keenly, wishing he were there to see how bright and curious his grandson had become. Sometimes I caught Daniel tilting his head the same way his grandfather used to, and it made my throat tighten with both sorrow and gratitude. The house itself seemed alive with these layers of memory. In the evenings when Marcus worked late at his drafting table and Daniel sprawled on the rug with his toy cars, I would sit in the old rocking chair by the fireplace. That chair had been my husband's favorite, worn, smooth by his hands. I often closed my eyes and imagined him sitting across from me, listening to the hum of our family life, nodding with quiet pride. He had always believed in strength through patience, in the power of silence to carry more weight than shouting. I tried to hold on to those lessons as the shadows of doubt crept closer. Still, there were moments with Elisa that unsettled me, even in the warmth of these domestic scenes. She would hum a lullaby to Daniel, her voice soft and low, and then a day later she would frown when he asked for the same song, insisting she didn't know it. At dinner, she would compliment Marcus on his projects with unusual detail, as though she had studied his work carefully. Then, the next week, she would barely remember what he had told her. I stored these oddities in my mind, tucked them into the corners of my thoughts like loose papers in a drawer, uncertain whether to bring them into the light. One Sunday, while preparing breakfast, I looked out the window and saw Elisa in the garden with Daniel. She bent down to tie his shoe, her movements graceful, tender. For a moment I felt reassured. The sunlight caught in her hair, and she looked so perfectly maternal, so devoted, that I scolded myself for my suspicious heart. Yet as she turned her head, the smile faltered, her eyes distant, almost cold, before she quickly noticed me watching and lifted her hand in a wave. That flicker unsettled me more than her smile soothed. Marcus, for his part, seemed to accept Elisa as she was, with only occasional flashes of doubt crossing his face. He told me once, in a rare unguarded moment, that he admired her resilience, how she managed the demands of being Victor's wife in a world of wealth and scrutiny. He didn't see what I saw, or perhaps he chose not to. After all, he had grown used to carrying silence in place of confrontation. In that way, he was very much like his father. The nights were hardest. When Daniel was asleep upstairs and Marcus had retreated to his study, I often sat awake in the quiet house, thinking about that phone call. My husband's photograph rested on the mantel, his eyes calm, his smile certain. I whispered questions to him in the stillness. Was I imagining things? Was grief clouding my judgment? Or had I stumbled into something far deeper than I wanted to admit? Family life continued, day after day, with meals shared, chores done, and visits exchanged. On the surface, everything looked ordinary, even warm. Yet beneath that surface, I felt a faint tremor, as though the floor beneath us was shifting, waiting for the right moment to break open. I learned to smile, to stir soup, to listen to Daniel's stories, all while carrying the weight of what I could not explain. That weight grew heavier each time Elisa walked through the door, each time I caught a look in her eyes that did not match the woman I thought I knew. And so, in the midst of laughter and routine, I carried an unspoken awareness. Something was not right in my home, and though I could not yet name it, I knew it was only the beginning of a story that would demand all of my strength. I began to notice little things that clung to my mind like burrs, the kind of details most people would overlook, but that kept gnawing at me. Elisa had always seemed consistent, polished, put together. Yet in recent weeks, her behavior shifted in ways I could not quite explain. One evening, she poured Daniel a glass of juice with her right hand, moving so naturally that I thought nothing of it. But the very next day, as she reached for a pen to sign a permission slip, she held it in her left. It was such a small inconsistency, yet it lodged in my memory. People could be ambidextrous, of course, but Elisa had never been before. There were other moments, too. Sometimes she was affectionate with Daniel, humming to him, brushing his hair back tenderly, and sometimes she was distant, snapping at him for small mistakes or looking at him as though he were someone else's child. Daniel, sensitive as he was, noticed it more than anyone. He would climb onto my lap in the evenings, his brow furrowed, and say things children were not supposed to carry in their hearts. "Grandma," he whispered one night, "yesterday Mom sang me the lullaby about the stars, but today she said she doesn't know that song. Why doesn't she remember?" His wide eyes searched mine for answers I could not give. I began writing things down in a small notebook I kept in my nightstand. It started innocently enough, a habit born of wanting to clear my mind before bed, but soon it became a necessity. I recorded the date, the incident, the way she spoke, which hand she used, the words Daniel repeated. I wrote about the way she smiled differently, once warm and luminous, another time sharp and empty. Each entry was like a puzzle piece that refused to fit with the others. One afternoon, as I folded laundry in the living room, Elisa came in wearing a silk blouse I'd never seen before, emerald green with delicate stitching at the collar. It looked expensive, and it was not her usual style. I complimented her, and she tilted her head, almost startled, before recovering with a grin. "Oh, this old thing. I've had it forever," but I knew she hadn't. A week later, when she returned with Daniel, she looked puzzled when I asked if she wanted the blouse pressed. She claimed she had no idea what I was talking about. The air in the house shifted subtly around her, as though she carried with her two different selves that appeared and disappeared at will. I found myself watching her constantly, trying to reconcile the woman who braided Daniel's hair with patience and the one who scolded him harshly for spilling a glass of milk. Even Marcus, usually so absorbed in his work, began to glance at her with mild confusion, though he quickly brushed it aside. One night, I heard Daniel murmuring in his sleep. I leaned closer and caught fragments of his dream talk. He was asking his mother not to forget the song again, pleading softly, as if the inconsistency haunted him. It made my chest ache to hear such longing in a child's voice. I kissed his forehead, tucked the blanket tighter, and returned to my room with a heavier heart. The more I wrote in my notebook, the more I realized how often these strange patterns appeared. They were no longer rare oddities, but regular occurrences, slipping into our days like shadows that lengthened with the setting sun. Elisa's eyes sometimes carried a flicker of recognition when she looked at me, as if daring me to notice, as if mocking my confusion. Other times, she was overly kind, pressing her hand on mine with warmth that seemed almost rehearsed. I tried to convince myself I was imagining it, that grief and loneliness were clouding my judgment, but Daniel's innocent words echoed in my ears. Children did not fabricate such things. They saw what was real, unfiltered and raw. His confusion was pure, and his questions demanded acknowledgement. One evening, as we sat together at the kitchen table, he looked up at me with that piercing honesty only a child possesses. "Grandma, do you think Mom has a twin? Because sometimes she feels like two different moms." My spoon clattered against the bowl, my heart thudding in my chest. I forced a smile, brushing his hair back. People can be complicated, sweetheart, I said softly. Sometimes they act differently depending on the day. But inside me, a storm was gathering. I turned the pages of my notebook that night, each entry a reminder that something was not as it should be. I remembered my husband's words, spoken long ago during a difficult time. The truth will always reveal itself to the patient heart. I clung to that memory, even as doubt gnawed at me, even as fear whispered that I might be standing on the edge of something I could not yet name. The house was quiet, the shadows long across the walls, and still my mind replayed every inconsistency. Elisa's shifting hands, her forgotten songs, her clothes that vanished as quickly as they appeared, Daniel's worried questions. Alone in my room, pen in hand, I realized I could no longer dismiss these signs. They were not accidents, not slips of memory. They were pieces of a reality I was only beginning to glimpse, a reality that frightened me more than I cared to admit. It was not long before my suspicions began to find echoes in the voices of others. Evelyn Carter, my neighbor and dear friend, had lived 2 houses down for more than 30 years. She was the kind of woman who noticed everything, who came and went, who lingered too long by the gate, who left lights burning into the night. One morning, as we shared tea in her garden, she leaned closer and lowered her voice. "Lorraine, I saw Elisa yesterday near the town square. She was rushing across the street carrying a paper bag of groceries. But the odd thing is, I had just passed her in front of the bakery 5 minutes earlier, and she was wearing a completely different coat." Her brows knit together in confusion. I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. But now, looking at you, I can see I'm not the only one wondering. I listened, my heart tightening. Evelyn was not given to exaggeration. She spoke carefully, never one to spread gossip without cause. The fact that she had noticed what I had begun to suspect sent a chill through me. I asked her to describe what she saw, and she did, with precise detail. The coat was cream-colored at the bakery, but green at the crosswalk. The groceries were absent the first time, present the second. Evelyn looked unsettled, and I realized she'd been holding back, not wanting to trouble me until she was sure. Later that week, another account reached me, this time from Mr. Collins, the baker whose shop was a cornerstone of our community. I stopped in to order a cake for Daniel's birthday, and while he wrapped the box, he leaned across the counter, lowering his voice. "I don't mean to pry, Mrs. Whitaker, but something strange happened last Tuesday. Your daughter-in-law came in, cheerful as always, asked for a dozen rolls. She even complimented my display. But the very next morning, she came in again, and when I mentioned our little chat, she looked at me blankly and asked who I was. It was as though she had never set foot in my store. I carried the cake home, my thoughts heavier than the box in my hands. Evelyn and Collins had seen what I had begun to sense, a woman who was not steady in her being, who seemed to change from day to day, whose memory and demeanor shifted like the wind. Their words confirmed that I was not imagining things. I was not losing my grip on reality. Others had witnessed it too. That night, as I set the table for dinner, I looked across at Elisa. She was polite, attentive, her conversation light. She asked Marcus about his work with genuine interest, laughing in all the right places. Yet I could not unhear the testimonies of my neighbors. Her smile seemed stretched over something hidden, a mask that threatened to slip if I watched too closely. I excused myself briefly and went upstairs to my room, pulling out my notebook. I added new entries. Evelyn's sighting, the coat, the groceries, Colin's story about the bakery. The notebook, once slim, had begun to grow thick with details that pointed in the same direction. As I wrote, I thought of Daniel asleep in the next room, trusting, innocent, unaware of the confusion surrounding his mother. The weight of responsibility pressed down on me. If no one else would piece this together, I would. I had promised my late husband that I would protect our children and grandchildren, that I would guard the home he built. His photograph on the nightstand seemed to meet my eyes, steady and reassuring. I see it too, I whispered into the quiet. Others see it. I am not alone. The following afternoon, Evelyn came by again. She carried a basket of apples from her orchard, but her expression was more serious than her gift. "Lorraine," she said, "I haven't been able to stop thinking about what I saw. There's something off, and I don't think it's just my imagination. Have you noticed anything strange yourself?" I hesitated for a long moment, torn between protecting the family's dignity and speaking the truth. Finally, I nodded. "Yes, I've noticed." Her relief was immediate, as though she had been waiting for me to confirm it. We sat together in my kitchen, peeling apples, speaking in hushed tones about the inconsistencies, the oddities, the sense of something just beyond explanation. The more I heard from others, the less I could deny it. These were not isolated mistakes, not tricks of memory or perception. They were patterns, seen by different eyes in different places, and each account wove tighter the net of suspicion that had begun to ensnare my heart. That evening, as the sun dipped low and shadows lengthened across the yard, I stood at the window watching Elisa play with Daniel. Her laughter rang out, bright and genuine, as she chased him through the grass. To anyone else, it was an idyllic scene, a mother and child, nothing amiss. But I could not unsee the cracks in the picture, could not forget Evelyn's words or Collins's confusion. I gripped the windowsill, the wood worn smooth by years of my husband's hands. A storm was gathering, not of thunder and lightning, but of truth pressing against the walls of our lives. I felt it in the pit of my stomach, the certainty that everything we thought we knew about Elisa was about to fracture. And though fear gripped me, a strange steadiness rose inside me too. I was not imagining this. I was not alone in seeing it. Others had borne witness, and together their voices would carry me forward into the unknown. That evening, as we gathered around the dinner table, a quiet tension seemed to hang in the air. The silverware clinked softly as I set the plates, but the usual comfort of these family dinners felt distant, strained. Elisa had arrived late, just after I had finished preparing the meal. Her smile was warm, but it did little to ease the tightness I felt in my chest. She greeted Marcus with her usual affectionate tone, kissing his cheek before settling beside him. I served the chicken and mashed potatoes, trying to focus on the task at hand. I had always prided myself on making family meals feel like a sanctuary, where we could put aside our troubles and simply enjoy being together. But tonight, the silence between us was palpable. It wasn't the kind of silence that held comfort. It was thick, heavy, full of unspoken things. As we ate, Daniel, always the lively one, started to chatter about his day at school. He spoke about a new friend he had made, a little girl named Sarah, and how they had played together in the sandbox. Elisa listened, nodding and smiling at all the right moments, but there was something off in her eyes. I had noticed it before, that flicker of something she couldn't hide. Her gaze seemed distracted, her thoughts far away. Suddenly, in the middle of Daniel's excited recounting, Elisa's voice cut through the room. "Daniel, stop talking and eat your food properly," she said sharply. Her tone was harsh, a stark contrast to the warm persona she had been projecting only moments before. Daniel, caught off guard, shrank back, his shoulders slumping. The sudden change in her demeanor made the room feel colder, and I saw Marcus stiffen beside her, his fork paused in midair. I cleared my throat, trying to break the awkwardness. "Elisa, it's just a story. Let him enjoy his dinner." But Elisa didn't seem to hear me. She didn't even look up. Her eyes were fixed on Daniel, now quietly chewing his food, his eyes downcast. I could see the confusion on his face, the hurt in the way he shifted in his seat, unsure of what he had done wrong. I felt my heart twist. This was not the Elisa I had known. The woman who had once walked into my home with grace, offering kindness and softness, was gone, replaced by someone sharp, brittle. Marcus shifted uncomfortably, his eyes flicking between Elisa and me, unsure how to intervene. I could tell he was trying to gauge the situation, trying to make sense of the sudden shift in his wife's behavior, but he said nothing. He never did when it came to Elisa. As the dinner dragged on, I couldn't help but notice more subtle signs. Elisa's hand, for example. As she reached for the bread basket, she used her left hand. It wasn't the first time I had seen her do this, but tonight it stood out to me more than ever. Her movements were off, like she was forcing herself to behave a certain way. It was as though she was playing a part, struggling to keep up the facade. Later that night, as we cleared the table, I caught Marcus's eye. He looked at me, his brow furrowed, and I could tell he was as unsettled as I was. "Is everything okay with her?" he asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. I hesitated before answering, unsure of how to express what had been building in me for days. "I don't know, Marcus. I'm starting to wonder if something's wrong." He shook his head, looking troubled. "What do you mean?" "I don't know," I admitted. "It's like she's not herself. She's been acting differently, like there's something inside her that doesn't belong. I'm starting to think I'm not the only one noticing it." Marcus looked away, his jaw tight. I could see the conflict in his eyes. He wanted to defend his wife, but something in him seemed to be wavering. I had never seen him so unsure of what to say. "Maybe you're just tired," he said finally, his voice lacking its usual conviction. "Maybe you're reading too much into it." I wanted to argue, to tell him that I wasn't imagining things, but I stopped myself. He wasn't ready to hear it. As the evening drew to a close, I found myself alone in the kitchen, washing the dishes, the sound of running water drowning out my thoughts. I had seen Elisa's behavior change before, but never like this. There was something deeper at work here, something I couldn't yet understand. I had spent my whole life trusting people, believing in the love and loyalty of family, but now I was questioning everything. The quiet of the house felt suffocating, the weight of my own thoughts pressing against me. I looked out the window at the darkened garden, the shadows stretching long across the grass. In the distance, I could see Elisa's car parked in the driveway, a constant reminder of her presence in my life, a presence that had once been comforting, but now felt like a threat, something I could no longer trust. I finished the dishes and dried my hands slowly, lost in thought. There were too many questions, too many inconsistencies. Elisa's behavior was becoming more erratic by the day, and I knew in my heart that something had to be done. But what? I glanced over at the small notebook where I had been writing down my observations. It was becoming my only guide through this confusing maze. I picked it up, turned to the latest entry, and added another note. Elisa's behavior tonight. Sharp, unprovoked, left hand. As I closed the notebook, a sense of dread washed over me. The pieces were starting to fit together in a way I couldn't ignore, but they also pointed to a truth I wasn't ready to face. Elisa was hiding something, and whatever it was only a matter of time before it would come to light. The following morning, I carried a basket of muffins across the street to Evelyn's house. She had been my neighbor and closest confidant for decades, the kind of friend who always noticed the changes in my voice before I admitted them myself. Her porch smelled of fresh lavender, and she greeted me warmly, ushering me inside. I set the basket on her table and tried to smile, but she caught the tension in my face immediately. "Lorraine," she said softly, "you've been carrying something heavy." "What is it?" I hesitated, glancing at the teacups she was setting out, the steam curling gently from the kettle. The comfort of her kitchen, with its shelves of neatly arranged jars and the ticking clock on the wall, made me feel safe enough to open up. I sat down, folded my hands, and let the words spill. "Evelyn, I don't know what's happening, but I can't ignore it anymore. Elisa is different. Some days she's gentle, warm, the daughter-in-law I thought I knew. Other days she's sharp, cold, almost like a stranger. And it isn't just her moods. Sometimes she uses her right hand, sometimes her left. She remembers things one day and forgets them the next. Even Daniel has noticed. He told me she sings him lullabies she later claims she's never heard of. Evelyn listened without interrupting, her brow furrowed. When I paused, she set the teapot down and reached for my hand. "You're not losing your mind, Lorraine." "I've seen it too." I looked at her, startled. "You have?" She nodded gravely. "A few weeks ago I was in town and I swear I saw Elisa near the pharmacy. She walked past me, barely glancing my way. But later that same afternoon I saw her again outside the florist shop. She was wearing different clothes, her hair pinned differently, and when I greeted her, she seemed not to recognize me at all. I thought perhaps I was mistaken, that maybe I had confused her with someone else. But Lorraine, I've known that woman long enough to be certain." Her words hit me with a force I wasn't ready for. I had hoped that speaking aloud my fears would bring relief, but instead her confirmation made my unease solid. "So you think it isn't just me imagining things?" "No," she said firmly. "Something is wrong. I don't know what it is, but you're right to be paying attention." I pressed a hand to my chest, trying to steady the pounding of my heart. Daniel has been so confused. He told me he feels like he has two mothers. He's too young to carry that kind of uncertainty. Evelyn's eyes softened. "Children sense more than we give them credit for. And they rarely lie about what they feel. If Daniel is noticing it, it must be real." I stared into my teacup, the reflection of my tired face staring back. I've been writing things down. Every strange detail, every inconsistency. I thought perhaps it was grief clouding me, or loneliness, or maybe even age. But the notebook is filling too quickly, Evelyn. Too many things don't add up. She squeezed my hand, her grip warm and steady. "Then keep writing. Keep watching. If there is something hidden here, it will reveal itself. You just have to be patient, Lorraine. The truth has a way of rising." Her words reminded me so much of my late husband that my eyes stung. He had always preached the power of patience, of steady observation over rash action. But this wasn't some ordinary family dispute. This was my home, my grandson, my son's marriage, and I felt as though an invisible current was pulling us towards something none of us could yet see. Evelyn stood and went to a small cabinet near her stove. She pulled out a worn notebook of her own, its edges frayed, its cover faded from years of use. She placed it gently on the table. "I've kept notes too," she admitted. "Not about Elisa at first, just little things around the neighborhood for my own memory. But recently I started jotting down the odd times I've seen her. I didn't want to alarm you until I was certain. But Lorraine, there's a pattern. She's been seen in places she couldn't possibly have been at the same time." I opened the notebook, flipping through her neat handwriting, and a chill ran down my spine. Dates and places matched my own entries. Different clothes, different moods, a blank stare where recognition should have been. Evelyn had seen it with her own eyes. We were both keeping records of the same strange puzzle. I leaned back in my chair, overwhelmed. If what we're seeing is real, Evelyn, what does it mean? "Who is she?" Evelyn's voice lowered, cautious. "I don't know, Lorraine. But I once knew a woman in another town, years ago, who swore she had seen her sister's reflection walking through the market when her sister was away. It made me wonder if sometimes life holds secrets we don't expect. I never forgot her story. And now, seeing Elisa..." She trailed off, her eyes searching mine. I felt a chill even in the warmth of her kitchen. For the first time, I allowed myself to wonder if Elisa had a shadow, another presence that mirrored her too closely to be coincidence. It was a thought that frightened me, but also gave shape to the confusion I had been carrying. When I left Evelyn's house that day, the air outside felt heavier, the sky lower. I walked home slowly, clutching her notebook against my chest. My own notes waited on my nightstand, and now hers would join them. Together, they painted a picture I could no longer ignore. Back in my house, I stood at the window, watching as Elisa's car pulled into the driveway. Daniel leapt out, running toward the door, his laughter ringing through the yard. Elisa followed, her steps graceful, her smile radiant, as though she were the perfect mother. Yet behind that smile, I saw the cracks Evelyn and I had both begun to trace. I knew then that the days of dismissing these suspicions were over. The evidence was stacking too high, the voices around me too clear. Something was deeply wrong, and whether I liked it or not, I was standing at the edge of discovering what it was. One evening, as the autumn air grew crisp and the leaves turned the streets golden, I made a decision I had been resisting for weeks. I could no longer rely solely on the accounts of others or the scattered entries in my notebook. I needed to see for myself, to follow Elisa where her polished smile could not shield her. After dinner, when Marcus had settled into his study and Daniel was upstairs playing with his toy cars, Elisa slipped out, saying she needed to pick up something from the store. I watched her through the window, the taillights of her car fading down the street. My heart pounded, but I grabbed my coat, slipped on my shoes, and followed. I kept a careful distance, letting the quiet hum of my old sedan blend into the night. She did not head toward the grocery store or any place familiar. Instead, she drove past the town square, past the line of shops closing for the evening, until the houses grew sparse and the roads narrower. At last, she turned down a lane I barely recognized, one that wound toward the outskirts where old homes leaned against time, forgotten and unkempt. I parked a short distance away and killed the engine. My breath fogged the glass as I watched her car roll to a stop in front of a weathered house, its paint peeling, its windows cracked. The porch sagged beneath years of neglect. This was not the place a woman like Elisa would ever choose to visit, not with her taste for beauty and luxury. Yet she stepped out of her car without hesitation, glancing around briefly before pulling her coat tighter and disappearing through the creaking door. I sat frozen, staring at the house, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles whitened. Minutes passed, then more. The night was silent except for the distant rustle of wind through the trees. My thoughts raced with possibilities, each more unsettling than the last. What business could she possibly have in such a place? Who could she be meeting? Finally, I forced myself to leave the car. I walked quietly along the edge of the road, the gravel crunching underfoot, until I was close enough to peer at the dim glow seeping through the windows. Shadows moved inside, one of them hers. I recognized her silhouette, the way she tilted her head, the curve of her shoulders. But there was another shadow too, faint and obscured. My chest tightened. She was not alone. I dared not get closer, afraid of being seen, so I lingered in the cold until the front door opened again. Elisa stepped out, her expression unreadable in the dim light. She carried nothing in her hands, and yet she moved as though burdened. She returned to her car and drove away swiftly, leaving the house in silence. I hurried back to my own car, my heart thudding as I turned the key. I took the long way home, giving her time to arrive before me. By the time I pulled into the driveway, her car was already there. I entered the house, forcing calm into my steps, and found her in the living room, casually flipping through a magazine. She had changed her clothes. The coat she wore earlier was gone, replaced by a soft sweater. She looked up at me, smiling easily. "Oh, you're back. Did you need anything from the store?" Her tone was light, as though she had been home all evening. For a moment, I could not answer. I simply stared at her, my throat tight, the image of her in that decrepit house burning in my mind. I wanted to confront her, to ask what game she was playing, but I swallowed the urge. Instead, I nodded, murmuring something vague, and excused myself. Upstairs, in the safety of my room, I opened my notebook and wrote everything down in hurried strokes. The drive through the town, the broken house, the shadows inside, the change of clothes, her calm demeanor when I returned. each line deepened the pit in my stomach. It was no longer about small inconsistencies or fleeting oddities. I had seen with my own eyes that she lived two lives, one of refinement and charm, the other cloaked in secrecy. Later that night, as I checked on Daniel sleeping peacefully under his blanket, I could not shake the sound of that door closing behind her, nor the image of that crumbling house. Elisa had been in two places that evening, in the house I followed her to and, impossibly, back here, waiting for me as though she had never left. I kissed Daniel's forehead, whispering a silent promise to protect him no matter the cost. When I returned to my room, I sat in the rocking chair by the window, my husband's chair, and stared out into the darkness. The questions pressed harder than ever, the lines between reality and deception blurring before my eyes. Who was Elisa? Or perhaps the better question was, how many Elisas were there? The very next day, I decided I could no longer stay silent or remain a passive witness. My suspicions had grown roots too deep to ignore, and the sight of Elisa slipping into that ruined house lingered in my mind like a shadow that refused to lift. I left the house after breakfast, telling Marcus I was going for a walk, but in truth I drove back to the outskirts of town, to that same lane where the broken houses leaned into one another like weary old men. The air was heavy with damp earth, and the road was quiet, as though time itself had forgotten this place. I parked a little farther away this time, hoping to blend into the landscape. My footsteps were slow, careful, the crunch of gravel muffled by the weight of my heartbeat. As I approached the weathered house where I had seen her before, I half expected it to be abandoned, its door locked, its windows shuttered. But the door stood ajar, a faint creak sounding as the breeze pushed against it. I hesitated before stepping inside. Dust floated in beams of weak sunlight filtering through broken panes. The smell of old wood and damp plaster filled my nose. The living room was bare, except for a sagging couch and a table with a chipped corner. And then I saw her. She was standing near the window, her back to me, her dark hair falling down her shoulders. For one fleeting moment, I thought it was Elisa. My breath caught in my throat, my knees nearly buckling beneath me. She turned slowly and my world tilted. The face staring back at me was Elisa's, and not Elisa's. The same sharp jawline, the same striking eyes, but softened by something else, something gentler. Her expression carried neither the polished charm nor the cutting coldness I had come to know. Instead, it was a mixture of caution and sadness. We stood in silence, measuring each other. Finally, she spoke, her voice steady but tinged with something fragile. "You shouldn't be here." I swallowed hard, clutching the strap of my handbag. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice little more than a whisper. She looked away for a moment, as though searching for courage. When her gaze returned to mine, there was no defiance, only a quiet resignation. "My name is Isolde." The name hung in the air, foreign and familiar at once. My heart pounded as I tried to comprehend what I was hearing. "You look exactly like Elisa," I said. Her lips curved. In a sad smile, "I know. People confuse us all the time, but I am not her." I could barely breathe. My mind flashed through every oddity I had witnessed, the shifting hands, the forgotten songs, the different clothes, the strange encounters others had described. It all began to make sense in a way I wished it did not. Why? The word slipped from me before I could stop it. "Why are you here, in this house? Why do you look like her?" Isolde stepped closer, though not too close, her eyes fixed on mine with a kind of pleading. "I can't explain everything now, but believe me when I say I never wanted you to find me this way. I was supposed to remain hidden." Her words pierced me. Hidden. The idea that there was a deliberate effort to conceal her existence filled me with both fear and determination. "You've been in my home," I said, the realization hitting me with sudden clarity. "Daniel spoke of songs you didn't remember. Marcus noticed you writing with your left hand. It was you, wasn't it? Isolde's face tightened with shame. She nodded once, slowly. I didn't want to hurt the boy. I tried to be kind, but I was asked to be there when Elisa couldn't. My breath caught again, my hands trembling. Asked by whom? Her eyes flickered toward the door as if afraid someone else might walk in. I can't tell you everything yet. But know this. I am not your enemy, Mrs. Whitaker. I never wanted to deceive you. I felt the ground beneath me shift. The woman before me was not Elisa, yet she bore her face, her voice, her very essence. I thought of Victor, of how betrayed he would feel, of Daniel's confusion, of Marcus's doubts. My mind spun with the weight of it all. You expect me to believe you're someone else? I asked, my voice trembling with equal parts fear and anger. Isolde's eyes glistened, though she did not let the tears fall. I don't expect you to believe me. But I hoped when the time came, you would understand. The room seemed to close in around us, the dust swirling like restless spirits. I stepped back toward the door, unable to stay any longer. I needed air, light, space to breathe. Isolde did not follow. She simply stood there watching me leave, her face a reflection of a truth I could not yet name but could no longer deny. When I stepped back into the sunlight, I pressed a hand to my chest, trying to calm the storm inside me. The notebook waiting at home would receive another entry that night, one that would change the course of everything that followed. Elisa was not alone in her own skin. There was another, Isolde, and now I had seen her with my own eyes. That night I could hardly sleep. The image of Isolde standing in that broken house lingered behind my eyes, her face so like Elisa's, and yet carrying a sorrow that did not belong to the woman I thought I knew. I rose before dawn, restless, and found myself walking through the quiet streets as the first light touched the rooftops. My steps carried me back toward that forgotten lane, compelled by a need I could not resist. If I had questions, she had answers, and I would not leave until she gave them. When I reached the house, the door was closed but not locked. I knocked softly, half expecting no reply. To my surprise, footsteps sounded within, and a moment later, Isolde appeared in the doorway. She looked tired, her eyes ringed with shadows, but she let me in without protest. The interior was the same, dusty air, cracked walls, a couch sagging under years of wear. She motioned for me to sit, and I lowered myself onto the edge of the couch, clutching my handbag like a shield. I need to understand, I said, my voice steady though my hands trembled. Why do you look like her? Why are you in my home pretending to be her? Isolde lowered herself onto the chair across from me. She folded her hands in her lap and stared at them as though the words she owed me were written there. Because she asked me to, she said at last. Elisa pays me. She tells me when to come, what to say, how to behave. I tried to follow her instructions, but it has never been perfect. That is why Daniel notices the songs. That is why you notice the small differences. I cannot be her entirely, no matter how hard I try. Her admission sent a rush of heat through me. I gripped my bag tighter, my pulse racing. You mean to tell me that all those times, when Elisa was in my house with Daniel, with Marcus, it might not have been her at all? Isolde nodded slowly, her expression pained. Sometimes it was me. She needed to be somewhere else, and she could not risk being discovered. I became her substitute. I know it was wrong, and I know it has hurt you, but I did not have a choice. The words cut deep. A wave of betrayal swept over me as I thought of my grandson, of the trust he had placed in the woman he called mother. Why would you agree to this? Why would you deceive a child, deceive a family? She lifted her eyes then, and I saw the raw truth in them. Because I needed the money. My parents were sick. The bills piled higher than I could ever pay. Elisa found me, offered me more than I had ever seen in my life, if only I would play her role when she needed it. At first it was rare, only an hour or two, but then it became longer, riskier. I told myself I was doing it for survival, that I would stop once my parents were stable. But the deeper I went, the harder it became to leave. Her voice broke, and she pressed a hand to her mouth to steady herself. I sat frozen, torn between anger and pity. I could not forgive the deception, yet I could not ignore the desperation in her confession. My father passed away last year, she continued softly, but my mother is still alive, still fragile. The doctors say she needs care I cannot afford, so I kept doing it. Elisa knows how to use people, and she knew I was vulnerable. She dangled hope in front of me, and I grabbed it because I didn't know what else to do. The silence stretched long between us. I stared at the cracked floorboards, trying to reconcile the woman before me with the web of lies I had stumbled into. Finally, I asked the question that had been burning inside me. Where is Elisa when you are in my home? Where does she go? Isolde's lips parted, but she hesitated. She glanced toward the window as though afraid someone might be listening. She has meetings, she said finally, her tone flat, evasive. Meetings that cannot be known to your son. Business, she calls it. But I have seen enough to know it is not business in the way she pretends. There are people she meets, places she goes, and she does not want Victor to ever find out. I felt my stomach turn. The pieces shifted into something darker than I had imagined. Elisa was not merely careless or forgetful. She had orchestrated this deception to cloak her absence, her secret life. Isolde leaned forward, her voice trembling now. I never meant to hurt Daniel. I tried to be gentle with him. He is a sweet boy, too pure for all of this. Sometimes, when I held his hand, I felt guilty, as though I were stealing a moment that was not mine. But I also felt human, needed. It was the first time in my life I had ever been called mother, even if it was not true. Her confession pierced me. For all the lies, there was also longing in her, a yearning that seemed genuine. But the damage she had helped create was undeniable. I rose from the couch, my knees stiff, my hands clutching the strap of my bag. You may have your reasons, but you must understand what this has done to my family. My grandson is confused. My son is blind to what is happening. And Victor, he has no idea what is being hidden from him. Isolde's eyes filled with tears, but she did not argue. I know, and I am sorry, but I am trapped too. Elisa holds the strings. I am only a shadow of her design. I walked toward the door, my heart heavy. As I stepped outside, the cool morning air hit me like a wave, sharp and unforgiving. I knew then that I could no longer dismiss what I had seen and heard. The lies had roots, and they stretched far deeper than I had imagined. I returned home with Isolde's confession echoing in my ears, each word heavy with the weight of deception and desperation. I could not let the matter rest. I needed to know who she truly was and why fate had placed her face inside my family's life. The following week, I began to ask quiet questions in town, careful not to let Elisa catch even the faintest rumor. My search led me to an old acquaintance, Mrs. Nora, a woman who had once lived at the edge of our community and was known for fostering children long ago. She was frail now, her hands trembling as she poured tea, her eyes cloudy with age, yet sharp when they focused. When I asked her about Isolde, she flinched as though struck. I wondered when someone would... Come, she murmured. She folded her hands in her lap, her thin fingers laced together. You must understand, it was many years ago. Things were different then. Families sometimes gave up what they could not keep. Elisa and Isolde. They were born together. Twin girls. Their mother died during childbirth and their father was gone before anyone could stop him. They were separated almost immediately. Elisa was taken in by relatives with money and means. Isolde was not so fortunate. She came to me, I felt the room tilt around me, the air thickening with the revelation. Twins. The word carried all the weight of every inconsistency, every strange detail, every moment I had doubted myself. My hands trembled as I set my teacup down. You mean to tell me they are sisters? That Elisa has a twin she never told anyone about? Mrs. Nora nodded slowly. Yes, I raised Isolde for a time, until she was placed elsewhere. But she always came back to me, even as she grew. She was quiet, reserved, but her heart was good. Life was never kind to her. She learned to survive in the shadows. Elisa, on the other hand, had every advantage. She was given the best schools, the best opportunities. 2 lives born from the same hour, yet divided into light and dark. Her words stirred a sorrow so deep in me, I had to grip the edge of the table to stay steady. Why keep it a secret? Why would Elisa hide her own sister? Because Elisa learned early that her name and her beauty opened doors, Mrs. Nora said softly. She built her life on ambition, on appearances. She feared that a sister raised in hardship would be seen as a flaw, a liability, so she erased Isolde from her story. But you cannot erase blood. It will always find its way back. The room was quiet except for the ticking of a clock on the mantel. I thought of Daniel, of how he sensed 2 mothers, how his young heart struggled to reconcile what no one had explained to him. He had been right all along, though he could never have understood it. Does Victor know? I asked, my voice hushed. Mrs. Nora shook her head. I doubt it. Elisa would never risk her place by admitting the truth. She has always wanted more, always reaching higher, never satisfied. But Isolde, she only ever wanted to belong. She only agreed to her sister's demands because she was desperate. That girl has carried shame that was never hers to carry. I closed my eyes for a moment, the weight of it pressing down on me. So every time I thought I saw a different side of Elisa, every time she forgot a song or used the wrong hand, it was Isolde. She was stepping into a life that was never meant for her. Mrs. Nora placed her hand gently on mine. Her skin was paper thin, her grip weak but sincere. Lorraine, I have lived long enough to know that secrets like these do not stay buried forever. You must decide what to do with the truth. But remember, Isolde is not your enemy. She is a victim, too. I drove home in silence, the countryside blurring past me. My thoughts circled like restless birds, never landing. When I reached the house, I found Daniel in the yard laughing as he chased a ball. His joy was pure, untouched by the shadows his family cast. I watched him and felt a fierce determination rise in me. He deserved to know a world built on honesty, not lies woven by adults. That night, after Marcus and Daniel had gone to bed, I sat alone by the fire, staring at the notebook filled with my entries. The pages now told a story not just of deception, but of a hidden history that bound Elisa and Isolde together in ways none of us had understood. My husband's photo rested above the fireplace, his eyes calm as ever. I whispered to him in the quiet, "They are sisters. Twins." The truth was right in front of us, hidden in plain sight. Sleep did not come easily. My dreams were filled with images of 2 infants crying in the same cradle, one carried into wealth, the other left behind. I awoke with tears on my cheeks and the knowledge that life had played a cruel hand. But even as sorrow weighed heavy, I felt clarity too. Elisa's choices had created this web, but the blood that tied her to Isolde was unbreakable. And now that I knew the truth, nothing could remain the same. Not long after Mrs. Nora revealed the truth about Elisa and Isolde, I received a call from Arthur Hale, an old friend of my late husband. Arthur had been a lawyer all his life, the kind of man who kept his files neat and his conscience even neater. His voice over the phone was low, urgent, and carried the kind of weight that made me grip the receiver tighter. "Lorraine," he said, "we need to talk about your daughter-in-law." "Meet me in my office tomorrow morning. I think you'll want to hear what I've uncovered." The next day, I walked into his downtown office, a quiet place lined with bookshelves stacked high with case law and family records. The smell of polished wood and paper filled the air. Arthur stood by the window, his spectacles slipping down his nose, a folder in his hand. When he turned to me, his expression was grave. He motioned for me to sit, and I did, my heart beating fast. "I've been following some unusual financial activity," he began. "It started when Victor asked me to look over certain contracts tied to the resort. The paperwork was polished, almost too polished, but something felt wrong. I dug deeper, and I found Elisa's name, not only once but repeatedly, hidden inside agreements. And she wasn't alone. Charles Harrington appears alongside her. At the mention of Charles, I stiffened. I had heard his name whispered in business circles before, a wealthy man with a reputation for charm and ruthlessness. He was no stranger to scandal, though he had always managed to bury it with money and influence. To think of Elisa linked with him sent a cold wave of dread through me. Arthur opened the folder and spread documents across his desk. Contracts, signatures, transfers of property that seemed to vanish from one name to another like a game of shells. She has been meeting with Harrington under the guise of business, but in truth she and Isolde were used as covers. When Elisa needed to be somewhere else, at a dinner with Victor, at your house with Daniel, Isolde stepped in, while Elisa was free to meet Harrington and sign these deals in secrecy. It's clever, Lorraine, but it's dangerous. They're funneling assets through shell companies, positioning themselves to acquire land surrounding the resort. If it succeeds, Victor's holdings could be compromised without him even realizing it. I stared at the papers, my hands trembling. All of the unease, the inconsistencies, the questions. It was no longer just about strange behavior or hidden family. It was about money, greed, and betrayal on a scale I hadn't dared to imagine. Arthur leaned back, removing his glasses and rubbing the bridge of his nose. I don't know how much Victor suspects. But if Elisa succeeds, he'll find himself cornered in his own empire. And Charles Harrington will own more than land. He'll own your family's future. I felt my throat tighten as I tried to process the enormity of it all. Victor had built his fortune with hard work and keen vision, yet the woman he trusted most was using his own brother's home, my home, as her cover for deceit. "Arthur, what do I do?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. "You keep watching," he said, "and you keep your records. Everything you've written in that notebook, every inconsistency you've noticed, it could be evidence one day. But don't confront her yet. Not until we have proof that will hold in court. If she realizes you know too much, she'll tighten her defenses. You must be cautious." When I left his office, the morning sun felt harsher than usual. I walked through the city streets with the folder of copies Arthur had given me, the weight of them pressing against my ribs. My mind raced with thoughts of Victor, who was hundreds of miles away managing business, unaware of the storm building around him. That evening, when Elisa appeared at my door with Daniel in tow, smiling as though she were the perfect wife and mother, I could hardly look at her without seeing the papers spread across Arthur's desk. She laughed lightly, complimented my cooking, kissed Daniel's hair, and carried herself with effortless grace. But to me, every smile was laced with the knowledge that she had built her life on secrets. When she left the room, I slipped into the study and called Victor. His voice was warm but tired. He was in meetings, his days long. I wanted to tell him everything, but I remembered Arthur's warning. "Are you all right, Mother?" he asked. "I'm fine," I answered, forcing calm into my tone. "But I need you to promise me something. Be careful who you trust right now. Even those closest to you may not have your best interests at heart." There was a pause on the line, a faint hint of worry in his silence. "Is this about Elisa?" he asked quietly. My breath caught. "Just stay alert," I said at last, "and call me when you can." We need to talk that night. As I sat in the rocking chair by the fire, I opened my notebook again. I copied down every detail Arthur had shared, every contract, every name. The pages had become more than a journal of suspicions. They were now a ledger of betrayal, proof that what I felt in my bones was real. I thought of my husband's steady wisdom, how he always believed the truth would rise. I whispered to him in the quiet room, "It's rising now, and I will not let it drown our family." In the days that followed, the atmosphere in my house grew heavier, though no one spoke of it openly. Marcus carried his drawings and blueprints from room to room, restless as though even his work could not anchor him. Daniel played on the rug with his toy cars, but I could see his laughter had lost some of its sparkle, and Elisa, gliding in and out with her polished grace, seemed almost too careful, too rehearsed, as though she sensed that the walls around her were beginning to thin. One evening, as we gathered for dinner, the tension became impossible to ignore. Marcus sat across from Elisa, his fork idle on his plate, his eyes studying her. She asked him about his latest project, a question she often posed, but when he began describing a design he had told her about only 2 nights ago before, she tilted her head blankly, as though hearing it for the first time. "That's interesting," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I never knew you were working on something like that." Marcus's brow furrowed. His glance flicked toward me, and for the first time, I saw in his face the dawning of doubt. He pressed her gently. "You don't remember?" "I showed you the sketches. Right here at this table, her laugh was quick, airy. I must have been distracted. You know how I am after long days, but I saw his jaw tighten, the way he set down his fork with more force than necessary. He was not satisfied with her excuse, and for the first time, he did not swallow it whole. My chest tightened with both fear and relief. He was finally beginning to see. Later, as I tucked Daniel into bed, he looked up at me with those wide eyes that always spoke the truth before his lips did. "Grandma," he whispered, "yesterday Mom said she didn't know the Star song. But tonight she sang it to me again, just like before." His little forehead wrinkled in confusion. "Why does she forget and then remember again?" I brushed his hair gently and kissed his cheek, my heart breaking. "Sometimes grown-ups get mixed up, sweetheart," I said softly. But inside the storm grew louder. The lies were unraveling and the child could see it as clearly as the adults. When I returned downstairs, Marcus was waiting for me in the kitchen. He leaned against the counter, his arms folded, his face shadowed by thought. "Mother," he said quietly, "you've noticed it too, haven't you?" I met his gaze, the unspoken truth passing between us. "Yes," I admitted. "For some time now." He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. At first I thought it was just stress. But now, I don't know. She forgets things she should remember. She acts like a different person from one day to the next. And Daniel, he's starting to ask questions. I don't know what to tell him. I placed a hand on his arm, steadying him. "We can't dismiss this anymore. There's more happening than she lets us see. I've been keeping notes, and there's a pattern. You see it too, don't you?" He hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, I do. And I hate myself for it, but I can't shake the feeling that we don't really know who she is anymore." His voice carried a mixture of sorrow and anger, the same mixture I had carried in silence for weeks. The room was quiet except for the ticking of the clock, each second pressing heavier on us. That night, as I sat by the fire with my notebook, I added Marcus's doubts and Daniel's questions to the pages already thick with evidence. I stared at the words until they blurred, then closed the book and pressed it to my chest. My husband's photograph seemed to watch from the mantel, his eyes calm and steady, as if reminding me that patience and truth would see us through. But the patience was wearing thin. My son had seen enough to begin doubting. My grandson was asking questions no child should carry, and the woman we welcomed into our home continued her charade with increasing cracks. I felt the weight of it pressing on all of us, the knowledge that sooner or later the truth would burst through, no matter how carefully Elisa tried to mask it. As I prepared for bed, I stood by the window, looking out at the dark garden, the shadows stretching across the grass. The house was quiet, but my mind was anything but. Marcus's doubts had surfaced, Daniel's innocence had spoken, and I knew we had crossed a threshold. The silence of suspicion was gone. We were now in the fragile space where trust was breaking, and there would be no turning back. Arthur called me 2 days later, his voice brisk and purposeful. "Lorraine, I need you and Victor to meet me at the resort," he said. "I have something you both must see." The urgency in his tone left no room for hesitation. I phoned Victor immediately, and though he was buried in meetings, he agreed to meet us that evening. My heart pounded the entire drive, the roads blurring past as I thought of everything I had recorded, every inconsistency that had piled up into a mountain of doubt. When I arrived, Arthur was already waiting in the lobby, his briefcase in hand, his eyes sharp behind his glasses. Victor came in moments later, his expression tense, the weight of his empire, pressing heavily on his shoulders. He hugged me quickly, then turned to Arthur. "What is this about?" "I don't have much time," Arthur gestured for us to follow. He led us through the polished hallways of the resort, past the scent of fresh lilies in vases and the murmur of guests enjoying their stay, until we reached a small private office in the back. He closed the door behind us and set his briefcase on the table. From it, he pulled a stack of papers and a small USB drive. "You need to see this," he said, sliding the drive into the computer. The screen flickered to life, displaying security footage from the resort. I leaned forward, my breath catching as the images played. There was Elisa, unmistakable in her elegance, walking through the lobby. On her arm was Charles Harrington, his hand pressing lightly against her back, his smile one of familiarity, not formality. They spoke in low voices, leaning close as though sharing secrets, not business. Victor's jaw tightened. "That could be any meeting," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. Arthur clicked to the next file. This one showed Elisa again, seated at a restaurant table inside the resort, her hand brushing against Charles's in a way no business partner would allow. Papers were spread before them, contracts that Charles slid across the table for her to sign. She lifted the pen without hesitation, her posture confident, almost triumphant. Victor's face paled. He stepped closer to the screen, his fists clenching. "That's her signature," he whispered. "She's signing without me." Arthur nodded grimly. "These are property agreements, Victor." Parcels of land surrounding this resort, funneled into companies tied to Harrington. She's leveraging your name, your trust, to build a future that excludes you, and she has been using her sister, Isolda, to cover her absence whenever she needed to make these arrangements unseen. The room spun around me as the truth cemented itself. All the suspicions, all the oddities, all the unanswered questions. They converged here, undeniable on the glowing screen before us. I reached for Victor's arm, steadying him as his world shifted. He turned to me, his eyes blazing with betrayal. "How long have you known?" I swallowed hard, long enough to see the signs. I tried to protect Daniel, to keep Marcus from unraveling, but I knew something was wrong. I never imagined it was this Victor's shoulders sagged as he sank into a chair, burying his face in his hands. The weight of his wife's deception pressed visibly down on him. I sat beside him, my heart aching. I wanted to tell him it would be all right, but the truth was too raw, too cutting for false comfort. Arthur gathered the papers into a neat pile. "We have enough here to build a case. With more digging, we can stop her before she takes more. But you need to be prepared. She won't surrender quietly." Victor lifted his head, his eyes sharp again, though pain lingered there. "I need Daniel safe," he said firmly. "Whatever happens, he cannot be caught in the crossfire." I reached for his hand, squeezing it. "I'll protect him. I promised, with everything I have. When we left the office, the bright lights of the resort felt harsh against my eyes. Guests moved about in blissful ignorance, sipping cocktails, laughing, unaware of the storm brewing in the walls around them. Victor walked beside me in silence, his face set, his resolve hardening with each step. That night, back at home, I added the day's revelations to my notebook. My handwriting shook, but I forced each word onto the page. The footage of Elisa with Charles, the contracts, the betrayal etched into my son's face. These were no longer suspicions. They were proof. I sat in the rocking chair, the fire casting shadows across the room. My husband's photograph watched from the mantel, his steady gaze a reminder of the strength I needed to carry. The truth is here now, I whispered into the quiet, and it will not be hidden any longer. I thought I had seen the worst of it when Arthur showed us those recordings, but the cruelty of deception has a way of deepening when it feels threatened. 2 nights later, after Marcus had gone to bed and Daniel was asleep upstairs, I sat alone in the kitchen, reviewing the notes in my journal. The house was quiet except for the ticking clock and the faint hum of the refrigerator. That was when my phone buzzed on the counter. It was a message from an unknown number. I hesitated before opening it, but curiosity and dread pushed me forward. The words on the screen made my blood run cold. If you speak, your family will break. Stay silent or watch everything you love fall apart. My hands shook as I read it again and again. The threat was clear, but what struck me most was the familiarity in its tone, as though it came from someone who believed they already had power over me. I stared at the glowing screen, the letters burning into my eyes, and for the first time in weeks, I felt true fear, not just suspicion or doubt, but fear that the danger I had sensed was reaching out to crush us. I rose and walked to the window, peering into the night. The garden stretched out in silence, the shadows long and still, but I could not shake the feeling of being watched. My heart pounded so loudly it drowned out the quiet around me. Whoever had sent the message knew enough about my life to strike at its core. I turned off the phone and placed it face down on the table, my palms pressed flat beside it. My husband's voice echoed in memory. Patience is power. But what patience could shield me from words like those? I thought of Daniel's small hands clutching mine, of Marcus trying to hold his world together, of Victor already burdened by the betrayal of his wife. I could not let this threat consume them, yet I could not pretend it wasn't real. The next morning, I tried to carry on as though nothing had happened. I prepared breakfast, buttering toast for Daniel and pouring coffee for Marcus, but my mind remained fixed on that message. Elisa came by later, her movements graceful, her smile dazzling, but her eyes lingered on me a fraction too long, as if testing whether I would break. I forced myself to meet her gaze, steady and calm, though inside me a storm raged. I slipped into the garden with Evelyn that afternoon, sharing what had happened in hushed tones while we gathered herbs for tea. She listened with her usual seriousness, then shook her head. "They're trying to frighten you into silence," she said firmly. "That message means you're closer to the truth than they want you to be. But Lorraine, you cannot let fear close your mouth. Fear is what they're counting on." Her words steadied me, though they did not erase the chill crawling across my skin. When I returned to the house, Daniel came running, clutching a drawing he had made. He held it up proudly. "Grandma, it's our family," he said. I looked at the crayon figures, himself, Marcus, me, and even Victor. Elisa was there too, her figure drawn in dark colors, her smile crooked. The innocence of it nearly broke me. He could see what we all tried so hard to hide. That evening, I added the message to my notebook, copying it word for word. I underlined it twice, then sat back in the rocking chair, staring at the fire. My husband's photograph looked down from the mantel, and I spoke softly to it. "They want to frighten me, but I won't let them. For the children, for Victor, for all of us. I will not stay silent. The threat had not silenced me. It had only sharpened my resolve. If anything, it told me that Elisa and her allies were growing desperate, that they sensed their carefully woven lies beginning to fray. I knew then that the time for waiting was drawing to a close. The truth would come to light, and no message, no shadow, no threat in the dark would stop it. The night of the dinner arrived, and my hands trembled as I set the table. Every plate, every glass, every piece of silverware had to be perfect, though I knew perfection would not mask the storm that was about to break. I had invited them all, Marcus, Victor, Daniel, Elisa, and even Isolde. Arthur was there too, his presence lending me strength, his quiet authority filling the spaces where my courage threatened to falter. Evelyn had offered to be nearby if I needed her, but this was something I had to face myself. The candles flickered against the polished wood, their light dancing across familiar faces now carrying unfamiliar tension. Daniel, sweet and unaware, fidgeted beside me, swinging his legs beneath the chair. Marcus was unusually quiet, his eyes heavy with suspicion, his hand tapping nervously against his glass. Victor sat tall, his jaw tight, his gaze flickering between Elisa and Arthur. And Elisa herself, radiant as always, glowed in the candlelight. Her smile, practiced, her voice smooth as she made polite remarks, unaware of the trap tightening around her. I cleared my throat, breaking the uneasy quiet. I wanted us all here tonight, because there are things that must be said, things that can no longer remain hidden. My words made Elisa's smile falter for the first time. She glanced around the table, her eyes narrowing as though calculating her next move. Arthur leaned forward, his voice steady. Elisa, we have evidence of your dealings with Charles Harrington. We have the contracts, the recordings, the meetings. You've been building an empire of your own behind Victor's back. The air cracked with silence. Victor's face hardened, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the table. Marcus turned sharply toward Elisa, his voice low and sharp. Is it true? For a moment she tried to laugh, to dismiss it, but the sound died in her throat. You don't understand, she snapped, her voice rising. Everything I've done has been for us, for Daniel, for the future. Victor's voice thundered across the table. For us? Signing away properties with Harrington behind my back? Lying to my family? Bringing another woman into our home to wear your face? Is that what you call building a future? Daniel's wide eyes darted between his parents, confusion clouding his innocence. I reached for his hand, steadying him as the storm raged. Arthur laid more papers on the table, sliding them toward Elisa. These are the documents. Your signatures, your dates, your presence confirmed by cameras. There is no denying it. Now Elisa's composure shattered. She rose from her seat, her voice trembling not with fear but with fury. You think you know everything, don't you? You think I should be grateful to stand in Victor's shadow, silent and smiling while he builds his empire? I was tired of being an ornament, a trophy wife. With Charles, I had power. I had a choice. Her words spilled like poison across the table, cutting deeper than any document could. Marcus stood, his chair scraping harshly against the floor. You used us all, he said bitterly. You used Daniel, you used Mother, you used every moment in this house to cover for your deceit. Elisa's eyes flashed as she turned to me. And you, she spat, her voice sharp with accusation. You've been spying, watching, writing in that little book of yours. Do you think you're the savior here, Lorraine? You've only ever been a meddling old woman who couldn't let go of control. Her words stung, but I did not flinch. I met her gaze with all the strength I could summon. I saw what you tried to hide, Elisa. And I will not apologize for protecting my family. You walked into this house with lies on your lips, and you thought no one would notice. But truth has a way of finding its way to the light. For the first time, Isolde spoke. She had been silent through most of the evening, her head bowed as though ashamed, but now she lifted her chin. "You made me complicit in your schemes. You paid me to deceive them. I agreed because I was desperate, but you took my weakness and turned it into your weapon. I won't let you do it anymore." Elisa's face twisted with rage as she looked at her sister, a mirror of herself yet stripped of the mask she wore so carefully. "You owe me everything," she hissed. "Without me, you would be nothing." Isolde's voice trembled, but her words carried weight. "Without you, I might have had peace." Victor rose slowly, his chair scraping across the floor, his figure looming over the table. His voice was low, steady, final. "This ends tonight, Elisa. I cannot forgive what you've done. Our marriage is over." The room fell into silence, broken only by Daniel's quiet sob as he clutched my hand tighter. Elisa's chest heaved as she looked around the table, her empire of secrets collapsing before her eyes. She turned, her gaze flicking from Victor to Marcus to me, and then to Isolde. For once she had no words. I held Daniel close, my heart breaking for the child caught in the crossfire, yet also steady with the knowledge that the truth had finally been spoken aloud. The lies had been dragged into the open, and though the night was filled with pain, it also carried the faint beginning of something else, the possibility of freedom. The hours after that dinner felt like days pressed into my chest. The confrontation had cracked the fragile shell that held us together, and now there was no hiding from the truth. The following morning, Victor came to the house, his face pale but resolute. Daniel trailed behind him, clutching a small toy in his hand, his eyes still swollen from tears. Elisa arrived a short while later, her presence filling the room with a tension so sharp it was hard to breathe. Victor stood in the living room, his hands clenched at his sides, his voice steady but low. "Elisa, I meant what I said last night. Our marriage is over." She tried to laugh, though the sound came out brittle. "Victor, don't be rash. We've built a life together. You don't just throw that away because of a few papers, a few misunderstandings." Arthur was there, seated in the corner with his files, his presence a reminder that this was more than family drama. It was betrayal, documented and undeniable. He opened the folder quietly and spoke without raising his voice. "It isn't a misunderstanding, Elisa. These contracts, the recordings, the witnesses, they all tell the same story. You signed deals with Charles Harrington in secret, using your sister as your stand-in to keep your absences hidden. This is deliberate deception, and it cannot be erased." Elisa's mask cracked. She turned to Victor, her voice sharp, her eyes blazing. "I did it for us, for our son. You think your empire is secure, but you don't see the sharks circling. Harrington was my chance to secure our future. If you can't see that, then you're a fool." Victor's face darkened. "Don't speak of Daniel as though he were your shield. You risked everything, our home, our business, our son's stability, for ambition and greed. That isn't protection. That's destruction." Daniel, standing near the couch, began to cry softly. I knelt beside him, pulling him close, whispering soothing words as his small body trembled. His little arms wrapped tightly around my neck, and I could feel his confusion pouring out through his sobs. He could not understand the contracts or the lies, only that the people he loved were tearing apart before his eyes. Marcus spoke then, his voice quiet but edged with anger. "I've ignored the signs for too long, Elisa. I defended you when Mother questioned your behavior. I told myself you were tired, distracted, anything but dishonest. But now I see it clearly. You've used us all. And you've hurt Daniel most of all." Elisa's composure collapsed entirely. Her shoulders shook as she gripped the back of a chair, her knuckles white. For the first time, she looked less like the untouchable woman who had swept into our lives with beauty and charm, and more like a cornered figure fighting against the inevitable. "You don't understand what it's like," she said through clenched teeth, "to always be seen as someone's wife, someone's mother, never your own person." I wanted more. I deserved more. Victor's voice broke, not with pity but with exhaustion. "You could have had more with honesty. You could have built a future with me by your side. Instead, you chose deception. And now you've lost everything." There was no shouting after that, no dramatic storm of words, only silence, heavy and suffocating. Elisa looked around the room one final time, her gaze lingering on Daniel, whose tear-streaked face pressed into my shoulder. For a fleeting moment, her expression softened, but it was gone as quickly as it came. Without another word, she turned and left, the sound of the door closing behind her, echoing through the house, like a final judgment. Victor sank into a chair, burying his face in his hands. Marcus stood still, his shoulders sagging under the weight of it all. Arthur gathered his papers quietly, giving us space. Daniel clung to me, his sobs slowly fading into hiccups as exhaustion overtook him. I held him tightly, rocking gently, whispering promises I prayed I could keep. "You're safe, my darling. You'll always be safe with me." When I looked up, Victor's eyes met mine, filled with grief but also a glimmer of relief. "It's over," he said softly, though we both knew that the damage would take years to mend. I nodded, though my heart ached. "It's the end of one thing," I whispered, "and the beginning of something else." The house was quiet once more, but it was a silence heavy with endings. We had reached the breaking point, and nothing would ever be the same again. After Elisa left, the house felt hollow, as though the walls themselves carried the echo of her absence. Victor stayed with us for several days, moving through the rooms in silence, his face shadowed by exhaustion. Marcus busied himself with his work, but I knew he was only distracting his heart from the pain of betrayal. The one who suffered most was Daniel. He carried his confusion in his eyes, asking questions we could not answer, questions that no child should have to form. It was on the third evening that Isolde came to the house. She had called earlier, her voice hesitant, asking if she might visit. I agreed, though part of me was uncertain. She arrived with no pretense, no polished smile, wearing a plain coat and carrying only a small bag. When she stepped inside, Daniel was in the living room, his cars spread across the rug. He looked up at her, and in that moment, my heart caught. His eyes widened, his lips parted, and before anyone could speak, he whispered, "Mom." The room froze. Victor stiffened. Marcus glanced sharply at me, and I felt the air tighten like a rope around my throat. But Isolde did not recoil or deny it. She knelt down slowly, her movements gentle, her face open with tenderness I had never seen in Elisa. "No, sweetheart," she said softly, her voice trembling. "I'm not your mom. But I am someone who cares very much about you." Daniel crawled into her arms without hesitation, burying his face against her shoulder. He clung to her as though he had been waiting for that embrace his whole life. My eyes filled with tears because I knew what he felt. The warmth, the gentleness, the consistency. Things he had been missing from Elisa's fractured presence. In that moment, he gave his heart to Isolde without knowing her name or her story. Victor stood rooted, his expression torn between pain and awe. Marcus leaned against the doorway, silent, watching as his nephew found comfort in the arms of the woman who shared his mother's face, but not her deceit. The room was heavy with unspoken truths, yet somehow lighter too, as though a piece of Daniel's confusion had finally found its answer. I sat in my rocking chair, my husband's chair, and let the tears slip down my cheeks. I thought of the long road that had led us here, the suspicions, the notes in my journal, the nights spent staring at shadows. And now, the truth stood before us, not in documents or recordings, but in the purest expression of a child's trust. Isolde held him close, whispering words I could not hear, and for the first time in weeks Daniel's breathing slowed, his little body relaxing as though he had found safe harbor. She looked up at me then, her eyes brimming. "I never meant for this," she said softly, "but I can't turn away from him now. He deserves love. He can count on." Victor's voice was low, heavy with sorrow. "You're not her," he said, his words both accusation and relief. "But you've given him something she never—" Could Isolde kiss the top of Daniel's head, her tears falling into his hair? "He doesn't care about bloodlines or contracts," she whispered. "He just needs someone to stay." Marcus crossed the room then, placing a steady hand on Victor's shoulder. "Maybe that's what we all need," he said quietly. The night stretched on, the fire crackling as shadows danced across the walls. None of us spoke much after that, but there was no need. The sight of Daniel asleep in Isolde's arms told us more than words could. It was a moment of quiet healing, fragile and uncertain, yet real. When I finally walked Isolde to the door later that night, she paused before stepping into the cool air. "I don't know what the future holds," she admitted, her eyes glistening, "but if you'll allow it, I want to be here for him." For Daniel, I reached for her hand, gripping it tightly. "Then stay," I said simply, "not for Elisa, not for the lies she wove. Stay for the boy who already sees you with his heart." As she walked away into the night, I felt both fear and hope twine within me. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, I sensed the possibility of something new taking root, perhaps even redemption in the most unexpected place. The weeks that followed carried a strange quiet, as though our home was learning to breathe again. Elisa was gone, but her absence left shadows that clung to every corner. Victor threw himself into work, though his visits to us grew more frequent, and I could see in his eyes that he was searching for something he had never known he needed. Daniel, meanwhile, seemed lighter when Isolde was near. She came often, never imposing, never assuming, simply present with a kind of gentle steadiness. She read to him, sang the songs Elisa had forgotten, listened when he spoke about his toys and his drawings. Each day I watched the boy's grief soften, replaced by a fragile joy. One evening, Victor arrived unannounced. He looked tired but determined, carrying himself with the weight of decisions not yet spoken. Daniel ran to him, his little arms wrapping tight around his father's legs. Isolde stood in the kitchen, preparing tea, and when Victor saw her, something shifted in his face. Not the guarded mask he wore in meetings, not the wounded man I had seen since Elisa's betrayal, but something softer, almost vulnerable. We sat down together after dinner. The fire burned low, filling the room with a warm glow. Marcus excused himself early, sensing the moment belonged to others. Daniel had fallen asleep on the couch, his small hand curled against Isolde's sleeve. I sat in my rocking chair, silent, observing the scene unfold as though I were watching threads weave themselves into a new pattern. Victor cleared his throat, his gaze fixed on Isolde. "You've done more for Daniel in these past weeks than Elisa ever did. You've been present, patient, kind. You've given him back his laughter." His voice wavered, though he steadied it quickly. "And you've given me something I never thought I would feel again. Hope." Isolde's cheeks flushed, and she lowered her eyes. "Victor, I never came here for anything more than to make amends. I wanted to help because I knew what Elisa had done, and I couldn't bear the weight of it anymore. I never expected—" She stopped, her words fading into silence. Victor leaned forward, his hands clasped, his voice quiet but clear. "I don't want to look back anymore. I want to build something real, something honest. I don't care about appearances, about the past, about the mistakes that led us here. What matters is Daniel and the future we can create for him. For us, he reached into his pocket then, pulling out a small velvet box. My breath caught as he opened it, revealing a simple ring, elegant without extravagance. He held it out toward her, his eyes steady. "Isolde, will you marry me?" The room seemed to still, the firelight flickering across her stunned face. Her hand flew to her mouth, tears gathering in her eyes. "Victor," she whispered, her voice trembling, "how can you ask me this after everything? After the lies, the part I played, the pain it caused. Because you're not defined by what Elisa forced you into," Victor said firmly. "You chose differently when it mattered. You chose honesty. You chose Daniel. And I see the woman you are, not the shadow you were made to carry." For a moment she covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. Then slowly she lowered them and looked at him with eyes full of both fear and longing. "Yes," she whispered, then stronger. "Yes, I will." Victor slid the ring onto her finger, his hands trembling slightly. Daniel stirred on the couch, blinking sleepily, and when he saw the ring, his face lit with innocent joy. "Does that mean you'll stay forever?" he asked, his small voice cutting through the heaviness like sunlight through clouds. Isolde gathered him into her arms, kissing his hair as tears slipped down her cheeks. "Yes, Daniel," she whispered, "I'll stay." I pressed a hand to my lips, my eyes blurring with tears. For weeks I had lived in fear, in anger, in sorrow. But in that moment I felt something shift inside me. Not all wounds heal quickly, and the scars of betrayal would not vanish. Yet here, in my own living room, I saw love reborn. Not the fragile kind built on appearance and ambition, but the kind forged in truth, in suffering, and in the quiet strength of choosing to stay. My husband's photograph watched from the mantel, the steady gaze I had turned to so many times. I whispered to him in my heart, "They will be all right. We will be all right." When the house grew quiet again after Victor's proposal, I found myself sitting by the fire, reflecting on the road we had walked to arrive here. The flames flickered against the logs, steady and bright, as if reminding me that even in darkness there is always a spark that survives. So much had been broken, yet something new had begun to take root. I thought of Daniel first because through his eyes I had seen truths the rest of us tried so hard to ignore. His innocence had cut through lies. His little questions had carried more weight than all the evidence stacked on Arthur's desk. It was Daniel who showed us what consistency, love, and presence meant, and in the end, it was his trust that bound Isolde to us. Marcus, too, lingered in my thoughts. He had carried his doubts quietly for so long, shielding me from burdens I already bore, until he could no longer deny what was in front of him. He stood at my side when the family fractured, and though his silence spoke more than his words, I knew it came from love. I often wondered what the future held for him, whether he would ever open his heart again beyond his work. But I trusted that time, and perhaps watching his younger brother's new beginning would soften the walls he built. And Victor, my youngest, my child who had risen from our modest beginnings to a world of wealth and power. He had been brought to his knees by betrayal, yet he did not remain there. I saw in him not just the businessman the world admired, but the boy I had raised, the one who had always longed for something real, something safe. He found it in the most unlikely of places, in the arms of a woman who looked like his greatest mistake, but carried the opposite within her. In choosing Isolde, he chose truth, and in choosing truth, he chose healing. Isolde's presence in our lives was still a tender thing, fragile as a bird's wing, yet I could see how deeply she cared for Daniel. She carried guilt, yes, but she also carried the strength to stand against it. Watching her laugh with him, listening to her gentle voice as she sang the songs Elisa had once forgotten, I felt hope stir inside me. Life had denied her much, but here, perhaps, She had finally found a home. As for me, I found myself turning often to the photograph above the mantel, the one of my husband with his steady eyes and quiet smile. I spoke to him in the evenings, not aloud, but in the silent way that only widows know. "You would have known," I told him more than once. "You would have seen through her charm and her schemes, and you would have told me to trust my heart. I only wish you could have been here to steady us through it." And yet, in some strange way, I felt he had been with us all along. Every time I hesitated, every time I thought I would break, I heard his voice reminding me that truth rises, no matter how hard people try to bury it. Life began to take on new rhythms. Daniel filled the house with laughter again, his drawings covering the refrigerator door. Marcus worked on a new design that he claimed was nothing, though I could see the fire in his eyes when he described it. Victor visited often, bringing flowers for me, sometimes stopping by just to sit quietly with Daniel and Isolde. The house, once shadowed by deception, began to feel alive again, though the scars remained. I often thought about Elisa, about the choices she made and the hunger that consumed her. I wondered whether she had always carried that ambition like a flame, or whether it had grown from fear of being unseen. Her absence was heavy, but I did not hate her. I pitied her. She had been given a chance at family, at love, at a future that could have been rich in more than money, and she squandered it for the illusion of control. That was her burden now, not ours. One evening, as I sat in the quiet with Daniel asleep upstairs and the house peaceful around me, I asked myself the question that had haunted me since the beginning. When faced with betrayal, with lies, with the risk of breaking the family I loved, what should I have done? Should I have remained silent, keeping the peace while the truth rotted beneath us? Or should I have done what I did, faced it, spoken it, even when it broke us apart first? I still don't know the answer, but I do know this. Silence would have destroyed us slowly. Speaking gave us pain, yes, but also freedom. And so I leave that question with you. If it were your family, your home, your life unraveling around secrets, would you stay silent to keep the peace, or would you choose to face the truth, no matter the cost?